first of all, and also thank you very much for the invitation to spend a few minutes with you this morning and provide an EPA perspective on from our vantage point in terms of a number of water issues and discuss a path forward that I think is relevant not only to EPA but also to many of the people in the room. But before I do that, what I'd like to do is start with some numbers. As Rick said, I'm an engineer by training, so I like to sort of put things in a numerical context. I looked at the website. IAPMO has recently celebrated your 80th anniversary. And so 80 years ago, sort of where was the United States at on a number of metrics? But one very important one was that we had 123 million people in the United States in 1930. Turn the clock forward to the early 70s, about 40 years ago, 203 million Americans, about an 80 million population increase. Also, about the time the Cuyahoga River was on fire and EPA was created. Today, about 305, 306 people in the United States, a million people in the United States. Again, an increase from 1970 of about 100 million people in those last 40 years. I think relevant to this morning's conversation and the business we're all in, if we look forward to the next 40 years and what the census tells us the United States will look like in 2050, they're calling for an additional 135 million people, or a 46% population increase. And as we look at sort of our products, our services, and that same water supply that David Friedman talked about, we'll have to service 439 million Americans. The Department of Agriculture tells us that in a portion of that time, 15 years, from 1982 to 1997, the population increased 15%, but the developed land in the United States increased 34%. In fact, within that same 15-year period, more than 25% of the land converted from rural application to urban application, more than 25% occurred during that 15-year period compared to sort of all conversions from colonial times. And so if you look at sort of how we've developed our natural resources, how we've developed our water resources, how we've developed the land available to us, I would suggest that sort of that model is not sustainable. It's not sustainable from a transportation standpoint. It's not sustainable from a housing standpoint, certainly from a climate, greenhouse gas standpoint, from energy standpoint, and also from a water standpoint. If we continue to develop in that dispersed format, certainly the pervious surfaces we're creating, and the stormwater implications have, stormwater runoff have implications for habitat and aquatic life. A home on a half-acre parcel uses 100% more water than a home on a 1/5 acre parcel. The dispersed inventory of housing that we have today and that we've proliferated over the last 40 years creates an inventory of water infrastructure that is difficult to manage and difficult to maintain over time. And the energy to move that water. The statistics are some 4% of the energy used nationally is used for the movement of water across the landscape, and here in California it approaches 20%. So those are the challenges, I think, as we look at some of the issues facing the water sector. But also I think there's potential upsides, if you will, to serve those additional 135 million Americans over the next 40 years. There will need to be either built or rebuilt 89 million new homes. Sort of what are the opportunities, I guess, both in economic opportunities and also efficiency opportunities that presents. And also some 190 billion additional square feet of schools, offices, commercial, and industrial space to serve that additional population. So what I wanted to do is talk about those numerics, if you will, those metrics, to inform the discussion as we move forward. From a water infrastructure standpoint, what we enjoy in the United States is envied in most of the rest of the world. When you turn on the tap, as Mr. Friedman said, basically safe, clean water is delivered, and when you flush, basically it works. But I think sort of it's also useful to sort of put that in perspective and a story that I recently heard at a meeting in D.C. where George Hawkins, who's now the general manager of the D.C. Water and Sewage Authority, talked about a experience he had back in early February. It was during the D.C. blizzard. We were in the process of getting about 2.5 feet of snow, and his beeper went off. There was a water main break about 2.5 miles from his house. There was nothing moving in town. So basically he put on the overshoes, the coat, and sort of walked through 2 feet of snow. And sure enough, when he got to the location, the geyser was rising up from the middle of the street. And through a fairly contrived process, was able to get some trucks out there, strap plows, blades on them, sort of clear it off so the crew could get down and repair the pipe. They determined when they got down there to repair that pipe that it had been installed in 1869. And his vision is there were sort of ex-Civil War soldiers, basically after the war, that were sort of part of the public works crew in D.C. putting in some of the early water main distributions. And in fact, twice since then, that pipe in that same neighborhood has failed. EPA does inventories or need surveys of water infrastructure across the United States. The most recent drinking water needs survey was based on data in 2007 and concluded a $335 billion need over the next 20 years for drinking water infrastructure. On the clean water, wastewater side, the most recent published data is for the 04 survey. That total was $202 billion, again, over a similar 20-year period. Within the near future, we'll be updating that based on the 08 survey. You put them both together, the numbers approach $550 billion of water infrastructure needs over the next 20 years across the country. What are we doing about it? Fair question. Within the last 18 months, there has been an unprecedented response from this administration, from this Congress, to sort of appropriate federal funds to be part of the solution. Between the 09 appropriation, the FY10 appropriation, and the American Restoration and Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the stimulus bill passed in February of 2009. A total of $11 billion, new dollars, have been put into water infrastructure, both on the drinking water and the wastewater side, to provide sort of additional capital through the state revolving funds to provide assistance for local water infrastructure projects. Focusing on the Recovery Act for a second, the total there was some $6 billion, funded approximately 3,400 projects, and a requirement that was attached uniquely to the water infrastructure account was that all those projects had to be under contract in a year. So basically, with a start date of February of 09, by February 19th of 2010, $6 billion in new water infrastructure projects had to be under contract. And with the extraordinary efforts of the states and many local governments that you, I'm sure, work for or work with, that deadline was accomplished. And the last date, on February 17th, it was about 6:15 in the afternoon. The last jurisdiction reported in, it happened to be the District of Columbia, who had executed their last $300,000 contract. But in terms of sort of the normal pace of public works construction, $6 billion in new projects in a year, encompassing sort of 3,400 plus individual transactions, was an amazing accomplishment.